good afternoon, especially for those on the East Coast. Steve, you're there in Texas, so it's at least afternoon there, barely, but afternoon there. And George, you're in North Carolina now. North Carolina? Yeah, North Carolina now.
South
Uh,
Carolina.
South Carolina. Okay. Thank you for joining with us. For those that are watching this after the fact, thank you for joining in as he's continuing to introduce the various toolboxes from the prison process. Overwhelmingly, guys, today is meant to be interactive. It's meant to be engaging um, as our whole process, our full process works. And so, what we're going to do is we're going to actually have some time to where, just like in our last webinar, you work with one another, talking these things out, giving feedback on your current circumstances, and really assessing those things preemptively. I will say that there's a lot of information that we're going to be coming out with. So it's going to feel like at times you're drinking water from a fire hydrant. But I'm always open for follow up, for questions, for conversations. That way it can continue to bring additional clarity there. But to get us started, I'm going to go ahead and open us up with a word of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, I just want to thank you. I want to thank you for your provision. I want to thank you for your plan. God, I just am grateful for the leaders that are watching this, the leaders that are on this call. I just continue to pray that you give them endurance as they seek to lead well and serve well in the capacities in which you've called them. Father, we know that in your word, the topic in which we were talking about has some merit. I mean, if we look at the book of Acts, we see that there are measures that are reflecting accomplishment and progress in the church's mission there in the book of Acts. We see that devotion to the word, fellowship, being in right standing with you and with others. We see that the breaking of bread, the Lord's Supper for accountability was there. And we also see that everything being permeated with prayer. Those were all measures of what it looked like to be a Christ-centric, gospel-focused, gospel-motivated church in the New Testament. And so those are measures that we even have today, God. And so we pray that as we have this conversation, that we would have clarity of mind, clarity of speech, and that it would help us as we lead well and serve well in the capacities in which you have, in the places in which you have called us. And so, Father, we thank you and we give you all the praise and the glory and the honor. We ask these things in your precious Son's name, amen. Now, to orient the conversation a little bit, the conversation around measures, it really takes place in the second phase of the process, immediately following the development of the network's mission. Some people call it other things, but one of the things that we call it the clarity frame. And at the top of the clarity frame, we're asking the question, when are we successful in accomplishing the mission? Or to put it another way, when are we winning at accomplishing the mission of our network? Before we get too deep in the weeds, what I want us to do is I want us to have a quick exercise. It's going to be about 5 minutes, quick exercise in which you go to page number 3 in the documents that we've provided. And what I want you to do is begin to identify what are your measures of success as a network. What are your measures of success as a network? I want you to focus on primarily just the left side of the graph for now. If it helps, maybe even write out your association or your network's current mission statement, and then be able to say, you know what, when do we know that we're winning at accomplishing our mission? This is really a flash assessment of your current measures. And so what we're going to do is going to give you 5 minutes, 6 minutes to identify what your measures are, measures of success as a network, and then kind of go from there. Any questions before we kind of step into that? No. If you're not part of a network, if you're watching this after the fact, you're not part of a network, you're part of a church, think about your association, think about your network, and think about what are its measures. The network that you're in, what are its measures of success? Do you know what its measures of success are? If you're not part of a network and you're just part of a church, then think through the implications of what it would be for the church. What's the mission of the church? And then what are the measures by which you're determining how are we winning, or when are we winning at accomplishing the mission? So we'll give you about 5 minutes to kind of write those things down, and then we'll have a period of reporting out. All right. So Steve, how did you do?
Well, I'm not quite sure how to, what's the right way to word all this, but our mission statement in our association currently is that we exist to glorify God through partnering, mobilizing, and strengthening churches to extend the gospel of Jesus Christ. So those three verbs, partnering, mobilizing, and strengthening, are sort of what I would say are the measures of our success. So I just kind of worded it as questions, do we have healthy churches? Maybe there's even more fundamental question, what does a healthy church look like? But do we have healthy churches? Are our churches making new disciples? And that would be the mobilizing part. And then when it comes to partnering, are our churches working together to be healthy and to make new disciples? And then in the fourth spot, I just simply put, the relational aspect. Am I seeing relationships develop between our churches instead of, what's traditionally been competition? Are they working together for the sake of the gospel?
Mm-hmm. Okay, good. That's a good start. No, I appreciate that. George, I don't know if you're still there. You're off screen. Maybe you are, but I think that as we look at those measures, and you kind of articulated those, Steve, how confident did you feel as you were articulating them?
So I don't know. I mean, I think we've done some good things to try to measure these things, but I think we have a long way to go.
Okay, that's good. That's good. So I appreciate that, and I appreciate that honesty there, and that's honestly one of the reasons why we wanted to have this conversation, is because a lot of the time for association, their measures are they're so-so, or I've even had associational leaders just point blank say in conversation, I have no idea what our measures are. I'm not even thought about that. I don't even begin to know where to start whenever it comes to developing measures. And so it's been all across the board. And so before we kind of get into the process of helping to refine those measures, I think it's important that we first define what we mean by measures. And so on page number 1 of the handout, you'll see various blanks about defining measures. And so what I want to do is I want to go through those, and then at the end of that, we'll have another opportunity for an exercise that we'll walk through as we kind of contemplate what measures look like and how to define those measures. So ultimately, measures, if you see there in number 1, ultimately measures, they answer the question, when are we successful? You've already heard me say that multiple times, but specifically, as I mentioned before, successful at accomplishing or making meaningful progress towards the mission. That's the main thing, is making meaningful progress towards the mission. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get there, but are you making progress towards the mission of the association, of the network? The second point for us is measures are visualized really as a bullseye. And ideally, everything in the network, everything in the association is designed around hitting that same target. As a kid, my responsibilities included chopping and splitting wood. I know I'm a Renaissance man. I had a wedge, I had a sledgehammer, I had an axe, and I had a hatchet. Those were my tools. You say, well, where did you live? I lived in Northeast Florida. Did we need wood? No, it was hot. But they had a fireplace and they wanted to burn in the fireplace. So those are my tools. And the center of the wedge was my target, not the wood. The center of the wedge was my target. And I knew that if I could focus all of my energy from my swing using the sledgehammer to the center of the wedge, met with the center of the sledgehammer, then I could make meaningful progress towards my mission, which was getting through the wood pile. And that should be the case for the network as well. See, you and your team aiming towards that same goal. And that kind of bleeds directly in to the third thing, is that all team members, they should know the measures, because every network offering and communication content is designed to help shape these outcomes throughout the network. The idea is that we're all focused in the same direction. And therefore, because we're all focused in the same direction, we're aiming towards that same target, it affects everything that we do throughout the network, and it makes it to where we're all moving in that same trajectory. The next point is measuring is different from counting. You count discrete data, whereas you measure continuous data. Measuring provides qualitative, not merely quantitative evidence of success on the mission. I used to help out on a dairy farm. I know, first chopping wood and now a dairy farm. And there were a lot of cows that were on the dairy farm. But the thing was, is we weren't merely counting the discrete number of cows. It wasn't about how many cows were in the field. We were measuring the quantity and the quality of the milk that they produced. Ultimately, that's what mattered. Ultimately, that's what the company that came and bought the milk and got the milk, that's what they cared about. They cared about the quantity and the quality of the milk that was being produced. They weren't caring about how much food it cost. They didn't care about how well the cows slept. They didn't care about how many cows there were. What mattered to them was the quality and quantity of the milk. Our network or associational measurements must have elements of both quantitative and qualitative data in them. A lot of the time, our measurements have quantitative data, but not necessarily qualitative data. The next point would be is that measures development, it begins with articulating and then requires varying degrees of ongoing assessment. The point being is that we're not only finding it important to measure, it's important to develop a system by which you can track this data. for the betterment of the association, for the betterment of the network or the denomination, is what is this system by which we are tracking this and making sure that we're going through an ongoing assessment. A lot of the times, the way that we want to do measurements is we want to do it once a year. We want to do it once, a quarter. Maybe it's done through an annual poll of some kind, or it's done through an annual meeting. But true qualitative and quantitative measurements, they require an ongoing assessment and evaluation. That means as you're sitting down with pastors, as you're sitting down with church leaders, as you're sitting down with churches, you having these measurements which you're able to gauge and say, are we being successful in our mission as an association, as a network? The next section on there on page 1, we kind of get into why are measurements important? And so I want to step into this before we go on to really working out some of the next steps and allowing you to kind of practice with these various measurements and evaluating them. But without measurements, the box, and if you were with us last time in the last webinar, we talked about the box being the network or the association which serves the cloud. And so the box or the network of the association, it will only measure a lot of the times inputs. In other words, the number of people, the number of churches, and the number of dollars in your network offering and programs. That oftentimes is what associations are measuring as their measures of, are we succeeding in our mission? If the money is going up in what it is that we're receiving from the church body, then we must be doing something right. That is a poor standard of measurement. In just a minute, we'll define what type of measurement that is. The second reason why measurements are important is because they provide a shared vocabulary that ultimately unifies the entire team. Steve, let me ask you this. Why would it be important for the whole team to have a shared language around measurements?
I would say at least partially because people are going to have different ideas of what success looks like. I mentioned earlier healthy churches. Well, and then I kind of made a comment. Of course, what is a healthy church? And so, if I have a leadership team that half of them have a different idea of what a healthy church is, and the other half because we haven't defined it well, then that's going to be a problem.
Yeah. As I think I've mentioned before when we've talked, the word healthy is a word that I often don't like to use. In fact, whenever I was at SB Cal, someone asked me the question during the workshop. They said, well, why don't you like the word healthy? And the reason why I don't like the word healthy is because, I use the illustration of a man that weighed 170 pounds. He doesn't exercise regularly. He eats what he wants. He doesn't care about his food intake. He's not counting calories. He's not doing any of those things. He weighs 170 pounds, but he's been at that weight for 10 years. Versus someone that's 240 pounds and they do exercise regularly. They do lift weights. They are running. They are counting calories. The question is which one of them is healthy? And there is no clear answer on that. Healthy is a matter of degrees. And so one of the things that we clearly talk about is how do we define healthy? And really we can't. But what we can define is there vibrancy? Is there vitality in that church body? Do we see meaningful progress take place in that church body? And so it's important that there is a shared language around measurements, because that way the whole team knows exactly what the target is. Steve, can you think of a biblical example about what happened when there was shared language and understanding among a people group. Think back to Genesis. It was such a good communication ability, such good skills, that God had to step down, anthropomorphism. He had to step down and confuse the people's languages, because his comment was, there's nothing that they won't be able to accomplish if they're able to communicate together. Imagine that if we were to use it in a positive way. Here we have shared language around what our target is and how much that can help catalyze the association as it seeks to move forward. The next point about why measurements are important is that they're a quality control for the box or the network or association. They're a quality control. It's to see, how are we doing? How are we doing when it comes to our mission? Are we executing well on this? It gives you sort of like a dashboard approach. If I'm driving in my car, I have several dashboard items that I keep in mind. And I'm looking at the temperature gauge, I'm looking at the speedometer, I'm looking at the gas gauge, I'm looking at the battery. I'm making sure that I've at least looked at those once, because if I'm not careful, it can interfere with my mission to make progress in any kind. And that's the same thing whenever it comes for a network or an association, is you have these different gauges that help you say, hey, is this something that's lacking? How are we doing in this particular area, especially in regards to accomplishing our mission? The next thing is, measures provide a basis for adjusting the strategy for better results. So measures, they're a means by which you can just adjust the strategy of what the association is. If all of a sudden you as an association recognize that this is our mission, these are our measures, but we're not able to hit these measures because something in our strategy is off, then we need to adjust that strategy so that we can hit that measure, ultimately so that we're accomplishing the mission. So they kind of give you a basis to say, okay, is our current strategy, or what we call our vehicles for value delivery, are they the right ones that we need to have in place as we're seeking to accomplish the mission that God is calling us into? Also, measures, they work to track the primary ways in which the box works to serve the cloud, rather than the cloud working to serve the box's agenda. This is super important because of the trap that, as we've talked about previously in other webinars and in other means, and the trap that can so easily fall into for a network is that they begin to give instruction to the cloud or to the churches on what they need to be doing to better support the network. Talked to an associational leader the other day, and we were talking through these very ideas, and he was agreeing that the box is there to support the cloud, and yet as he considered his measurements were all about who's showing up to our events, who's showing up at our activities. Well, his measurements were really about, hey, are the people showing up there, and are they supporting the box like we need them to, versus the box making sure that it's serving and supporting the cloud? And so measures track the ways in which the box is serving the cloud. In just a minute, what we're going to do is we're going to go into another breakout session where really it'll just be you and I, Steve. We'll work through your current measures. and we're going to work through them based on the categories of measurement. And those categories of measurement are input, output, and impact. And so we're going to go through and define these. So if you look on page 2, you'll see the definitions of these types of measurements results. And the first is on input results. And input results, they focus on really the numbers of participants or dollars. What's another way that you've heard this described, Steve?
In regard to like associational participation, I would say that, yeah, I mean, dollars, numbers of churches, most recently our leadership team was looking at the numbers and basically came to the 80-20 principle. 20% of the churches are giving the money to support 80%, of the work. And so anyway, it always seems to come back to dollars and numbers.
Yeah. Nickels and noses and bodies and bank accounts. Those are some of the shorthand ways. These are the typical means of evaluation. Why do you think that these are the typical means of evaluation?
I think they're the easiest thing to measure. I mean, it doesn't take a whole lot of work to put out a roll sheet at your next event and see how many pastors came out.
Right. Unfortunately, I mean, it's the equivalent of, if you look at that chart that is there on page 2, it's the equivalent of, an orange juice company, putting out a roll to see, okay, how many gallons of water did it take to feed this tree? How many hours of sunlight did it take? How much fertilizer was necessary? Now, that doesn't measure the right things for them, especially whenever it comes to making money. Now, it's important to measure those things. It's important for them to know those things. For the local church, a lot of the time, their input measures are around weekly worship attendance. They're around the plate, the number of people who participate in events. And as you mentioned, how many pastors showed up at our annual church conference? How many pastors showed up at our annual meeting? How many pastors were there as we did VBS training or whatever it might be? But those things are good to measure, but they're not indicators of mission success unless the mission success is merely to get people to show up and give. If that's the mission, then that's successful. They showed up and they gave. But I'm hoping that our missions are a much bigger picture than that we're hoping transformation takes place, that we're seeing life change, that we're seeing impact made. That's what I hope that we're hoping for. The gospel advanced, people encouraged. And so that's what we should be measuring, and that focuses on the next type of result. The next type of result is the output result. The output result, what it indicates are genuine indicators that reflect the accomplishment and the progress of the network's mission. Genuine indicators of the accomplishment and progress of the network's mission. Going back to my dairy cow days, it's about the quality and the quantity of the milk produced. It's about that type of output. The orange juice company illustration, they care about the oranges, the pounds per tree. They want to know about the juiciness, the sweetness of what's being produced. For me, how much pulp is this orange creating? I'm a big pulp man. I want to be able to stick the straw in it so it stands up straight in the center of it like they have it at Cracker Barrel. I care that much about my pulp. For the local church, it's, can people articulate the gospel message? Do they have a shared vision of what it is that God is pulling them in to do as a congregation? Do they know what it means to be a disciple? Not only do they know what it means to be a disciple, but are they walking the path of a disciple and then helping others to walk in that path? Are they seeing true transformation take place? Is there accomplishment and progress happening towards the mission in which God is calling us to? The last measure that a lot of organizations, associations, networks they'll use is the impact result. These are the things that the orange juice companies, they can't control. It's outside of the local church's control, really and truly, about how many people show up. It's about managing the product well, managing the inputs, measuring the outputs, and making adjustments along the way. But when it comes to the impact results, that's something we can't necessarily control. It's something that happens after the fact. So here's what I want you to do over the next 15 minutes or so. We're going to work on page number 3. And what I want us to do is I want us to consider the measures that you listed on your current stuff. Measure those for your current association. And I want you to consider what type of measurements those are. And then what we're going to do is we're going to move to page number 4. And we're going to assess, based on that case study that you see on page number 4, it's a list of different ones, what type of input are each one of those things? And you want to remember, as you're doing that on page number 4, you're looking at it from the perspective of an association. Keep in mind that you're working from the perspective of a network. You're not working from the perspective of a church, but as a network or an association or denomination, what type of input, output, or impact measure is this? What type of result is this that's being measured here? And then what we're going to do is we'll report out after that. So I'm going to go ahead and pause this, and then we will come back in just a minute after we work through that. Go ahead and unpause. So as you come back from assessing, those first measures that you put in there, but even as you step into the case study, what did you find to be true about your current measurements that you are using to evaluate your success as a network?
Well, for me, I think almost every single one of them were impact and not really, they were not really the output measurements that they needed to be.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. As you looked at the case study, what became more clear as you worked through the list?
Well, I think as I'm working through it, it's starting to become clearer, just the distinctions. I think it's hard for me to distinguish between output and impact. Input's kind of easy,
Mm-hmm.
but it's the output, the impact, and you begin to see the things that are outside of really the purview of the association as being more long-term impact, or the things inside of the association that we can actually measure. And so it starts to become clearer the more you just go through a list like this.
Yeah. What was meaningful as you kind of worked through that list? Was there anything that became meaningful as you were kind of working through it? It was like a light bulb moment.
Well, I think that when we discussed just the percentage of churches whose ethnic makeup matches their local community, I think the light bulb moment for me, when you asked, what does the association really have any control over that, is that my role as a leader of the association cannot be to set the vision or the dreams of the local church,
Mm-hmm.
but to let them accomplish the dream that God puts on their heart and facilitate that. And so I read that and I think, oh yeah, I'd love to see our churches ethnic makeup matching their local community, because that's a passion in my heart. But that's not my role, is to shepherd each one of those churches. And
Yeah.
that's something, because I came into this, it's something I'm still learning, because I came into this role, I've only been in it for 4 years, after having been a pastor my whole life. And I'm having to shift from pastor mode to more of a consultant strategist mode. And that's a continual process for me. So this was helpful. And I think number 9 was sort of a light bulb moment to show that
Yeah.
that difference of thinking that I'm working through.
That's good. That's good. One of the greatest struggles that we find for associational leaders, network leaders, denominational leaders is this propensity to try to lead the network like they would lead a church.
Hmm.
Um, it's the whole idea of some leaders step into the role and they say, um, I'm going to meet with all these pastors, I'm going to have all these conversations. And what comes across to the pastor is, I know that you have a church, but I've received a vision from God about what your church is supposed to do, and He has a wonderful plan for your church. Um,
Hmm.
and the reality is that doesn't do anything but add to the value gap between the association or the network and the churches themselves. And so I think it's a healthy thing to acknowledge, and it's a struggle because sometimes we do see things that they don't see. We see opportunities that they don't see. And we think,
Right.
why won't you just do this? Why don't you just step into this? Why don't you just go this direction? But the reality is, as a network leader, our role is really to ask questions. Our role is to support and strengthen in the direction in which God is leading that church body. God is leading that pastor and helping them accomplish the vision in which God is pulling them into. And if they don't have a vision, say, how do we develop that? How do we develop, not me tell you what it is, but how do we develop that in your midst? And so I'm glad that you said that. That's encouraging to me. It's that's the reason why we're doing what we're doing. Now,
Hmm.
on pages 5 and 6, what I've done is I've provided you all with this blank setup, similar to the other one that you've already filled out. And my encouragement to you is to consider using this really as a means to start a conversation. Start a conversation with your team, whether it be your associational staff or it be your leadership team that is made up of pastors, but start a conversation with them about measurements. Now, one thing to remember when it comes about measurements are not goals. These are not destinations, but they're indicators that we're effectively living out the mission in which God has called us to. Now, you can build goals off of these, but they ultimately are providing you with ongoing clarity around if you're living out your mission with effectiveness. The other thing to consider as you work with your team, when you put your mission above that little graph that has those 4 spots in it, and you begin to consider, is our mission meaningful enough to exegete quality measurements from it? Does our mission reflect the heart of the association? Does it reflect it in such a way that ultimately the mission sparks a fire in pastors' hearts when they hear what the mission of the association is? Does it incline them to say, yes, we want to be a part of that? Does the mission of the association define the direction? Does it inform the pathway? Does it integrate the activity of everybody that joins in? Does it direct energy? Does it inspire action whenever you hear the mission? Whenever pastors and church leaders hears the mission? And if it doesn't, then before a team begins looking at their measures, it may be time to say, hey, we need to work on our mission. On page number 6, though, there are some helpful examples of output measures. It's from the Michigan Baptist, and you may see that helpful. As you consider measures and what we've covered thus far, what sort of questions does it raise for you? What sort of things stand out as you think about measures in regards to your network?
I don't know if it's really generating any real questions right now, other than just food for thought. Just think it's making me rethink our mission statement a little bit. How measurable. I mean, if I gave the mission statement just to one of our pastors and asked them to measure how our association was doing in those 3 areas, I'm not sure that would be easy to do. So, I want our pastors to be able to look at the network and say, hey, yes, that's something that's valuable for us to be a part of, but they're also getting it done. They're actually doing what we signed on to, that's actually happening.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure right now that things are clear enough for our churches to be able to do that.
Right. And that's a good, honest observation to make, because to jump into it without having that clarity, it can produce frustration. And it's important to acknowledge that, because the last thing you want to do is frustrate. And so I think that's valuable. One of the common questions that we do get around measurements is, how do we get this data? How do we mine this data out? How do we store this information as we develop our measures? And that can be done in a variety of different ways. You can populate it on an Excel spreadsheet. You can put it together, keeping notes. You can do a team report out as, various teams are meeting with pastors, or you can just have a simple form that people fill out as you engage with them. Say, hey, we're continuing an ongoing measurement of whether or not we're being successful of accomplishing our mission as a network. And so would you be willing to fill this out at either the beginning or the end of every meeting that you have? And that gives you data right there. And then you keep that data up to date, and it gives you a standard by saying, okay, I have this data here and I've kept it all together, and then populating it. And it allows you to see, hey, how are we doing at doing these things? And then it allows you to, make adjustments from there. Just for the sake of wanting to make sure, fully understand, this is around measurements. It's really the second part of the process. The full PRISM process is a 3-phase process. The first part of it, Steve, we kind of go through a rediscover the network phase. It's around the idea of understanding the various tools and the strengths and any pitfalls or potholes for the network, but kind of evaluating where the network is currently at and owning that value gap that may exist. And so really those assessments provide really insights into the strengths of the network, because we want to make an emphasis on, hey, what are the good things that are happening and what are signs of health and strength? And so when we move over to the clarity frame, it helps in developing that mission, answering the question, what do we do in all that we do? When are we successful at accomplishing the mission? How do we do what it is that we do? And Why do we do it whenever it comes to the value side of things? And then ultimately we move inside the clarity frame and we go into where is God leading us over the next 3 to 5 years. The ultimate objective is what we want to see is a network and the pastors and the churches that make up that network to have a shared vision of where God is leading them over the next 5 to 7 years. And then really tangible steps on how to accomplish that. The last phase of the process is around upgrading your DNA. And what I mean by that is upgrading your discovering next approach, discovering next approach towards making meaningful progress. It's a 6-week intensive process to where we really equip the associational leaders with core competencies to help them be able to step into churches, flash assess churches based on what it is they see, based on various lenses. How do you invite a church into a process? How do you lead a church to identify what their best next step is, not pushing them, instead asking questions in such a way as it pulls them into the future? And then how do we create a pathway for them? How do we develop a pathway so that they can succeed in what it is that God is calling them to do? And then how do we get them to do something and get it done? And then ultimately, how do we celebrate that so that everybody around them, the other churches in the network, but not only the other churches, but that church feels good about what it is that God is has called them to do? And that kind of starts the whole cycle over again. Any questions as we wrap up our time, as you kind of hear these things, you think about things, any questions that you have, Steve, that stand out?
No, not really, not at this point.
Okay. Well, thanks so much for joining us. If you have other additional questions, don't hesitate to reach out to prismprocess.com /contact us or contact us -us, and we'll be happy to chat with you.